Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here again, taking your sources, research, notes, all of it, and pulling out the key insights.
Trying to make sense of the complex stuff.
Exactly. And today we're digging into something, well, pretty unconventional. It challenges the narratives we usually hear about major historical events.
We all know the official stories, right?
Right. But what if there's more going on underneath? A deeper story, maybe more complex, connecting things you wouldn't expect. So today's deep dive focuses on the September 11th attacks, but through a very specific lens.
Yeah, this isn't just about looking outwards at external threats.
No, it's about looking inwards, too, at a complicated web of internal convergences, as these sources put it.
So our mission today,
Our mission is to unpack what's in this specific set of documents described as confidential reports, strategic memos, alternative analyses. They propose this idea of a systemic transition, either orchestrated or maybe just exploited by various internal interests.
and it's really crucial to underline where this info comes from.
Absolutely vital. These are not your standard history books or mainstream accounts.
No.
They're labeled confidential analyses, strategic memos, alternative readings, apparently from intelligence or geopolitical assessment circles.
So we're just exploring the ideas in these documents.
Exactly. We're laying out the hypotheses they present. We're not endorsing them as fact, just examining the framework.
Okay.
So let's step into this. It's a fascinating, sometimes startling way of looking at things.
It definitely pushes you to think differently about power shifts,
Right.
global threats, to look past the surface.
For sure. And these documents, they start somewhere kind of surprising, re-examining John Gotti.
Yeah, the Gambino boss. Most people think they know that story.
Right. But here he's framed not just as a criminal, but as a clandestine statesman. They even compare him to Brezhnev.
A clandestine statesman.
Yeah.
What does that even mean in this context?
Well, the sources highlight his power structure.
Right.
Very organized, hierarchical, very pragmatic. They call it supranational, operating beyond just U.S. borders with real influence.
So contacts in unions, ports, New York institutions.
Exactly. Making him, in their words, a local geopolitical actor. Not just a gangster, but someone playing a bigger game.
That's a different way to put it. And they mention FBI reports.
Yeah, confidential ones still classified, apparently suggesting he was indirectly involved in negotiations, maybe even threats involving state actors.
Wow. Okay.
Now, here's a key claim from the analysis. Gotti gets sidelined in 1992. And these sources say this timing isn't random. It coincides exactly with the rise of foreign mafias,
Specifically.
Albanian, Russian, Turkish groups. And here's the kicker, allegedly supported by factions from the former Eastern Bloc.
Right. This ties into their whole argument about the Soviet Union's fall in '91.
How so?
Well, the conventional wisdom is collapse. But these documents argue it wasn't an end, it was a strategic shift.
A shift.
Yeah, they say it freed it from its ideological facade, basically turning it into what they call a global mafia network.
So it didn't just disappear, it morphed.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
They claim former KGB, GRU, even Afghan militia elements became the backbone of this new global contraband system.
And it wasn't just about personnel moving around.
No, it was methodological, too. The sources detail how these new groups picked up Soviet methods.
Like what?
Compromise, dissimulation, hiding true intentions, disinformation, standard tradecraft, basically.
Okay.
And then these methods were allegedly adopted by cartels, Mexican, Turkish, Albanian, Chinese, making them key players in global trafficking. Arms, people, rare metals, energy.
The works, it's a vast network they're describing.
What's really striking, though, is the idea that these weren't just criminal outfits. The analysis links them, ideologically, to what they call surviving nuclei of occult Bolshevism.
Occult Bolshevism, what does that mean? Hidden ideology.
Sort of a hidden, enduring ideological current, yeah. Not the overt political system, but something deeper, suggesting continuity rather than just collapse. It's pretty out there.
Definitely layers upon layers here. And as we go deeper, the Albanian mafia really comes into focus.
Right. Late 90s, they emerge as this crucial link arms, human trafficking, currency connecting the Balkans, Turkey, and the U.S.
And the documents allege connections to the military.
Yeah, proximity links, they call them, to high-ranking figures from the Kosovo War, specifically General Wesley Clark, NATO Supreme Commander back in '99.
Proximity links. What's the substance there?
Well, these internal reports, again, not publicly confirmed, suggest NATO-protected Albanian militias might have used U.S. supply lines, logistical corridors, to set up criminal cells right here on the East Coast.
Wow. And they implicate Clark directly.
The documents suggest Clark maybe indirectly, or through what they term strategic naivety,
Strategic naivety, like turning a blind eye.
or maybe just not realizing the full implications. But the suggestion is he offered political cover, perhaps thinking he was backing pro-Western allies in the Balkans while these networks exploited the situation.
So what does that say about, the system's vulnerability?
Well, the implication in this analysis is stark. It suggests that even high-level military leaders, maybe unknowingly, could become sort of conduits for foreign criminal infiltration. It's a serious claim about potential blind spots in national security.
Heavy stuff. And speaking of big figures, let's talk Giuliani, mayor during 9/11, famous for his anti-mafia push in the 90s.
Right, the tough-on-crime image.
But these sources, looking back, they paint a really different picture.
How so?
They claim his war on crime mostly hit the declining Italian factions,
Okay.
but it allegedly left intact or even favored the rise of these newer, more violent, better-funded foreign networks.
So, selective enforcement.
That's the suggestion. They claim he built his career on this vigilante image, but behind the scenes, he was consolidating tacit agreements, sort of unspoken deals with underworld economic players.
Especially in which sectors?
Real estate, transport, political financing, key areas in New York.
So, it wasn't really about dismantling organized crime overall?
According to this analysis, no. It was more like a strategic reshuffle. A changing of the guard, maybe? A change of mafia type, not getting rid of the underlying logic.
Redefining the win, perhaps?
Yeah, which leads to this broader concept in the documents, systemic infiltration.
Meaning organized crime embedding itself within legitimate Western institutions.
Exactly. And one source goes really deep into this highly speculative dogma theory.
Okay, what's that?
It posits this idea of a crypto-Jewish sect that supposedly infiltrated, well, almost everything.
Like what?
The Christian church, through esoteric orders, globalist bodies, UN, EU, IMF, allied with post-Soviet elites, even Western militaries through certain family lines or double agents.
That is quite a theory. It sounds like something out of a novel.
It's definitely presented as speculative, but it paints this picture of incredibly deep, almost invisible influence networks.
So the significance of this, according to the analysis, is the normalization of these criminal structures, like they become part of the furniture.
Pretty much. That they can weave themselves into the international economic fabric, even influencing supranational bodies, religious groups, acting as soft influence vectors. It really blurs the lines we normally draw between state, business, and crime.
Challenging fundamental assumptions there.
And they don't just talk theory, they name names, or at least point to profiles. Specific claims about top military figures.
Right, like General Mark Milley.
Yeah, the sources suggest, again, unconfirmed indirect links to former East European diplomats or technocrats from the late Soviet era.
And General Wesley Clark again.
They mention his background, Jewish origins in Yugoslavia, later converting to Christianity. And they cite classified documents allegedly linking him indirectly to figures close to the exiled Iranian monarchy, the Pahlavis.
Okay, so what's the conclusion they draw from these profiles?
They argue these examples show a kind of fusion between military elites, fallen diplomatic networks, competing geopolitical interests, all sometimes hidden behind the flag of national service.
And pointing to a vulnerability.
Yeah, what they call the vulnerability of the Western command chain to long-term foreign influence.
Which then sets the stage for looking at Iran, right? That's a big piece in this geopolitical puzzle they're assembling.
Absolutely. The sources give this alternative take on the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
Not just a popular uprising.
They suggest it might have been opportunely tolerated, even catalyzed, by some Soviet and Western circles.
Tolerated, why? What would be the goal?
According to these documents, dual objectives. First, get rid of the Shah, who is U.S.-aligned, while also weakening Sunni rivals like Saudi Arabia.
Okay, and second?
Create a regime in Iran that's durably unstable but controllable, using religious figures to indirectly control the Gulf region.
So Iran becomes a sort of pivot point.
Exactly. A pivot of instrumentalized confessional conflicts using religious divides strategically, and also an energy player they could manipulate, bring online, or take offline to control global oil and gas flows. Part of a much bigger game.
A game of controlling resources and regions.
Right. And all this groundwork, this complex web, according to these analyses, it leads to 9/11.
Okay, the official story. Al-Qaeda, Saudi nationals, we know that.
But these sources present counterclaims. They cite elements, supposedly from French, German, Russian intelligence,
Suggesting what?
suggesting possible prior knowledge by some agencies, but no action taken to prevent it.
That's a huge allegation. Prior knowledge and inaction.
It is. And the documents then outline the alleged purposes or outcomes of 9/11 from this specific analytical viewpoint.
Okay, let's hear them.
One claim: it was used to eliminate obsolete or too visible criminal structures, like the older Italian-American mobs. Clearing the decks, maybe?
Interesting. Why not?
It allowed for creating a massive federal security apparatus. Patriot Act, Homeland Security, justifying centralized power and mass surveillance.
A known consequence, but framed here as a purpose.
Right. And they say it helped consolidate new influence circuits.
A mix.
International organized crime, this thing they call security capitalism, private security firms, defense contractors making bank and former military figures moving into those sectors.
Oh, power nexus.
Yeah. Plus, obviously, it justified a long, drawn-out war in the Middle East.
Which they claim involved destroying competing infrastructure.
That's part of the analysis.
Right.
And also strategically weakening Saudi Arabia through constant suspicion, tying them indirectly to the attacks.
Keeping them off balance.
And finally, a really long-term goal alleged in these documents, slowly paving the way for a controlled geopolitical return of Iran through subtle channels, humanitarian aid, cultural programs, academic exchanges, even floating names like Prince Reza Pahlavi as potential future compromise figures for the region.
It's a very intricate, long-game strategy they're outlining.
It is. And New York City itself, the target. It becomes symbolic in this view.
How so?
Part of global finance, historical mafia territory, it represents the transition point from the old Cold War world to this new era of networks, gray zones, parastate actors.
So 9/11 wasn't just an attack from outside.
In this analysis, no. It was a first simulation, a kind of programmed trigger, designed, they argue, to kickstart this massive geopolitical and energy rebalancing.
It's a fundamentally different interpretation of what happened and why.
Absolutely. So just to quickly recap the core idea from these specific sources we've looked at today.
Go ahead.
They propose 9/11 wasn't just an external hit. It was part of a complex systemic shift, either orchestrated or maybe just tolerated or cleverly exploited.
By a mix of converging interests.
Exactly. Restructured mafias, military figures may be used or naive, opportunistic politicians, rising global networks, all coming together in that moment.
And we have to stress again, this isn't presented as some single grand conspiracy in the documents.
No, it's more like a convergence of cynical interests, as they put it, exploiting the cracks and vulnerabilities in the Western system after the Cold War ended.
And our goal here was just to lay out that specific framework from these continental reports neutrally.
Precisely. And as we wrap up, maybe something for you, the listener, to think about. What are the implications if we consider analyses like this? How does it change how we see major historical events, the forces shaping things behind the scenes?
If official narratives aren't always the full story, what else might have deeper, more complex drivers?
Yeah. Thinking about these alternative frameworks, how might that shift your view of current global events, the stories we're told about them today? Something to ponder.